Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Well, welcome everyone to the podcast today, the Mental Healthy Podcast. I'm glad to have you with us. I've got a great guest with us today, Dr. Floyd Godfrey. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Godfrey.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I know we spoke earlier, you prefer Floyd, so I'll call you Floyd, but we're glad to have you. And, the listeners, they meet all kinds of neat people here on the podcast. So why don't you give them a little bit of background on yourself before we get started?
Yeah, in terms of education, I received a psychology degree from Arizona State University. I have a master's degree from Ottawa University. And then I did a PhD in clinical sexology from the International Institute of Clinical Sexology. So educationally, that's where I'm at. I'm 56 years old. I've been married for 32 years. I have three amazing kids, three college students, and that's a little bit about me.
Oh, that's neat. I was funny. I was going to ask you about the clinical sexology, and you got it from the International Institute of Sexology, I think you said?
Yes, that's right.
Here in America, a lot of times people get their sex certification or sex therapy certification through like either AACC or STAR or ABCST or something like that. But this is an international group that you're with, apparently.
This is an international university. I'm no longer doing a certification with them, but they're based in the U.S., but they are internationally, they have students from all over the world. And so in my cohort, we had people from Saudi Arabia, from all different places in the world. South Africa, Europe.
Well, that's neat. I know with the listeners, who work in all different areas of mental health, running into issues related to sexuality and all kinds of issues with that are pretty common. And some people feel more prepared and others don't. But can you tell us a little bit about your professional and educational experience as a clinical sexologist? Like, what's it like doing that work?
Are you asking educationally or professional experience?
I guess both, really, to be honest. Yeah.
Well, educationally, up through my master's degree, a lot of general kinds of classes. You're learning how to be a counselor, learning how to do therapy, learning clinical work, gaining educational clinical insights. It wasn't until I was well into my career that I decided to pursue the PhD in clinical sexology, because I was already working with so many. At that point, I'd worked with hundreds of men, women, and youth who have sexual confusion or different kinds of sexual issues going on. And so then I pursued the PhD. The institute that I received my degree from is extremely liberal and very mainstream in terms of what they teach and those agendas. So depending on your faith background, it was a little challenging in class sometimes to hear different things being taught. On the other hand, it gave me a very well-rounded perspective on different opinions and what people think and how they think and why they think those things, and helping people from different directions.
Yeah, probably a lot of the Alfred Kinsey model of sex education and things like that, probably.
I would, yes, to the nth degree. It was very much so. And I'm sure that they would have invited Kinsey onto their staff if they had had that opportunity.
I'm sure, yeah. Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier some of the kind of people you work with, but could you elaborate on that a little bit? Like what kind of clientele do you run into that have struggles in these areas?
Yeah, originally I started my career 25 years ago working with kids. So I really wanted to be a play therapist. And so I worked with children and youth, but over the course of a couple years, I had all kinds of pastoral referrals from all different faith-based organizations. I'm very faith-based myself as a Christian, and so sometimes people felt more comfortable referring clients to me when they had confusion about sexuality issues, and I had a lot of success. And so I started to I guess, develop this reputation that I could really help folks who are struggling with sexuality issues. And over time, I would say over the course of the next few years, that was my entire caseload. I was just dealing 40 hours a week with people who had sexuality issues. So And we're talking about all kinds of sexual issues, everything from sex therapy, having difficulty there, sex education issues, to working with sex offenders. And I did a lot of work with sex addiction and developed some curriculum out of the office in Mesa here. And we developed a series of manuals to help men who were addicted to sexual behavior, to pornography, a lot of pornography, and a track for their wives who often experience betrayal trauma. And then we also had courses and classes for groups for young adults in college and kids in high school. So I would say the vast majority of all this work has been working with pornography addiction, sexual addiction, and then some other kinds of sexual issues, including on sexualized attachments and all of the symptoms that are related to that, and sexual abuse and sex, all those kinds of things. And it's often a taboo topic. So I think that's part of the niche I've fallen into, is many counselors don't want to touch the topic, especially if you're working with a sex offender or, a lot of the men who struggle with sexual addiction, their wives are falling apart with the intimate betrayal and PTSD symptoms because of the betrayal. And it's messy. And as a therapist, you have a lot of emotional chaos you have to help them walk through. And I was willing to. And so I worked with a lot of clients because I was willing to, and learned along the way, and then got my degrees along the way. I find it to be very satisfying. It's just a little taboo topic at times.
Yeah, that's true. There was a period in my career as well where I worked with sexuality topics a lot, and I've got a number of friends that do, like you, and but it's funny, all of them have slam-packed practices, and because there's so much need in this area. But I know this whole topic though is highly polarized, like in society and all that. So, for you, has your work always been well received, or have you had any bumps along the way with this whole topic?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. I would say the first 10 years, people left me alone. I was getting so many referrals and faith-based folks just filled with recovery and living happy lives, and a lot of success that way. And then probably the next 12 to 15 years, I've had all kinds of backlash. So, ranging from being picketed at a conference to receiving calls at the office. I've written a couple books on topics that are highly controversial, and helping people, for example, with unwanted same-sex attraction, or people are struggling, they want to leave the gay lifestyle, or they're confused about what their identity is. I released another book in 2023 that created all kinds of backlash. And I didn't know to what extent, I've had the media, journalists spin stories, try and make me out to be a shock therapist or a conversion therapist or something crazy. I just provide counseling for people, and they do well. I did get a lot of backlash and was directly attacked in 2023 by a couple dishonest employees who falsified some stories, went to the board. The board accused me of sexual harassment, and so at that point I retired my license from clinical work. My lawyer told me later that they had been targeting me, and they'd had private conversations with him about wanting to publicly smear me, wanting to discredit me, I guess, so to speak. And so in an effort to get away from that and not deal with that, I chose to step away from clinical work and doing more consulting and coaching at this point.
It's interesting. I mean, you're not the first person I've talked to who's dealt with sexuality topics. And if you don't, I don't know how the right way to say this, if you don't toe the party line per se, the way certain people in society want you to talk about sex, you get attacked.
Oh yeah.
And it sounds like that was, partly your experience as well, that you seem to offer a variety of opportunities and approaches to sexuality struggles that clients have that some people in society really don't want clients to have.
No, I think that's very true, and it's interesting because the activists, or even some of my clients who chose a different path, which I don't have a judgment about. If someone, people should live how they want to live. Uh, they're often the ones who are yelling and screaming and upset. Uh, and the irony is, I don't really care. Like, I don't have a preference. I care about you for sure, but I don't really care what you choose to do. I'm not judging you, and yet they seem to have a bone to pick about it, and so I don't know always why they do some of the things they do. It is a very, you know, uh, taboo topic, makes people upset.
Well, there's a whole field now of quote unquote affirmative therapy, where all they want you to do is to agree with the client.
Yeah,
And all I can say is, if you agreed with all your clients, you would have multiple personalities. I mean, you would just be fake
yeah,
as a $3 bill, because
yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, we got clients coming in with all different beliefs and stuff and all that.
Oh
And if you
yeah,
say you agree with everyone, you're just a liar. That's all there
yeah,
is to it.
yeah. I
So,
think you have to really stick to the truth, and
yeah,
I
yeah.
also think, as a counselor, if you're going to be a good counselor, if you're in school, or you're currently working as a therapist, I also think you learn how you have to be diplomatic. So I can present truth to someone without trying to cram it down their throat, or I can challenge them on a topic, and have them think about some things. And so that's kind of an important piece.
Sure, definitely. Well, let me dive into some content here. I heard you use a few phrases earlier that maybe the average listener is not familiar with. You
Mm.
talked about sexualized attachments. What does that phrase mean? And could you give an example or two to maybe flesh it out a little bit?
Yeah, sexualized attachment, it's really a psychological phenomenon that's been around for decades, and we do have research on it. We just don't always talk about it a lot or use that term. The International Institute for Trauma Addiction Professionals uses it frequently, um, when they're working with people, and Dr. Patrick Carnes has referred to it frequently. Sexualized attachments is essentially the sexualization of emotional issues. And so you might have attachment wounds or attachment deficits or emotional turmoil, and it gets all drawn into sexual energy. And now, what was once just emotional stuff starts to feel sexual in nature. So I think a good example of that would be abuse, and something we would call trauma repetition. That's a sexualized attachment issue. So you might have suppose you have a little girl who is molested or raped, and then later in life she tends to seek out partners where that abuse is very similar, or the partnership creates that same sort of dynamic, and that would be a trauma repetition. So the emotional fear and all of the emotional issues she had going on in the moment of the trauma gets sexualized in nature, and then later on she's going back to that. um, you can have, uh, in situations where you have an offender who is raping people or manipulating people. Don't want to be too graphic, but you often find a child who grew up without any sense of control, feeling out of control, and so now suddenly you have all this anger and this need to be in control that's getting sexualized, and it's almost like the two get fused together. Uh, and I guess another good example, when I've had young men who've been confused about their sexual identity, am I gay, am I bisexual, and talking to them, oftentimes, uh, well, some of them at least, didn't have a father, and they remember growing up with this longing, this father hunger, this mentor hunger to have a man who would be there for them, to reach out to them. Like, they'd go to church and watch the father and son. Dad's got his arm around the kid, and they're just in tears because they're longing for that. That longing then gets sexualized. The attachment hunger gets sexualized. So now you have what feels like a sexual or a homosexual feeling is actually the sexualization of his longing for a father figure. And that's just one example. There could be lots of examples, but I think in a nutshell, sexualized attachments is the fusion of emotional energy with sexual energy.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense because, like, when you were giving those examples, I can certainly think of clients I've had over the years that fit that. I mean, like the example you gave of the young girl that's raped, and then she sort of seeks out relationships where there's sort of aggressive kind of sexual interactions. And
Yeah.
I know when I've talked to those clients before, I'm like, why do you put yourself in that situation? And they always say something to the effect of that it feels familiar or something like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
And it is familiar. I mean,
Yes. Yes.
it's not rocket science. It is familiar, but it's not familiar in a good way. It's familiar in a bad way.
Yes. Yes. And you might also hear them say, Kenyon, that it feels natural. I hear that all the time. Well, it just feels natural, I think. And I think that sometimes reinforces this whole genetic theory that people are born a certain way, because this little girl says, well, I always kind of liked that. I always felt that. I always needed men like that, or it just feels natural to me. And the truth is, when sexualized attachment occurs and that fusion happens, over time, you almost have this imprinting. Like the brain memorizes this pattern. It memorizes, so the boy who grew up without a dad, over the years, as that fusion continues to deepen and it sort of imprints itself deeper into the psyche, or he keeps reinforcing it with behaviors, with father figures, sexually acting out, it gets memorized. So now not only does it feel natural because of the emotional component, but now it's hard to stop the flow of those feelings because they're so imprinted. They're just always there. And that's definitely a barrier to therapy. It's trying to get over some of that imprinting.
Yeah, definitely. It gets reinforced so much that it just becomes the norm.
Yes.
You're right.
And their brain
Well,
defaults back to what it knows.
yeah, true, definitely. I don't want to oversimplify this, but you're right. We are like Pavlov's dogs a little bit. I mean, we
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
can be conditioned a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I'm starting to get my head around this whole idea that you're talking about with sexualized attachments. But what are some of the other symptoms of sexualized attachment that maybe describe it a little bit more? Because I'm
Yeah.
sure the listeners are the same like me. Like everything we're saying makes sense, but I'm trying to connect all the dots here of, what, like if I have a client come in and they've got certain symptoms, what would those symptoms be that really would clue you in that they might have a sexualized attachment?
Yeah. Normally, Kenyon, the symptoms presenting in the counseling office have been more serious or confusing to them. So, it might be someone who says, "I have gay feelings, but I don't think I'm gay," or "That doesn't seem like who I am," or somebody who has confusion about their gender, or someone who has repetitive thoughts or dreams or fantasies. And so that's what's bringing them into the office. Something's wrong. But underneath that, the other symptoms you might see would be attachment wounds. You'd see depression, anxiety. In some cases, you'd see clients who are struggling not to drink, substance abuse, as a way of offsetting some of those wounds and needs. You might see social difficulties. Um, and so, all the things you might associate with emotional wounding or attachment deficits or attachment wounds, you'd be looking for that sort of thing. So it could be any number of symptoms, but again, I think the most presenting issue would be when the client comes in and says, "I think I'm a woman, but in a man's body." Those kinds of issues are more presenting, more common, and then you have to sort of underneath, calculate the other things.
Yeah. Yeah, forgive me, Floyd, but I have to go down a slight rabbit trail here.
Okay.
We've got a fair number of graduate students listening to us, and when they talk about sexuality and stuff, the number one piece of evidence they hear all the time in all these secular programs is from the ACA Code of Ethics, don't impose your values on your clients. But it's so ironic to me that when you have a client that comes in like you were just describing and the client says, well, I'm feeling some same-sex attraction issues that are not congruent with me. Like maybe I don't agree with that, but I feel those feelings sometimes. Everyone in the secular field now says, oh, you need to tell the client you have to accept that's, you have to accept that as that's your orientation and all that. But when counselors do that, they're imposing values on the client.
Yes.
And yet we say, oh, don't impose your values. But that's one area where the whole secular field does impose values on clients.
Yes. Yes.
Instead, if they were going to really follow their own code of ethics, what they would say is, okay, well, so you have these feelings that you don't like, and you have some other beliefs or whatever in your life that doesn't jive with that. How do you want to work it out?
Yes. Yes.
And
Absolutely.
put it back on the client. Let them sort of decide like what values most to them. I mean, like how do they choose to resolve that issue based on their own belief system?
Absolutely. And that's definitely an ethical issue in the field. It's such a huge concern, and we ought to be worried about that, especially if you're a Christian counselor or faith-based in nature, for someone to be imposing those kinds of values when you ought to be very client directed. But I will tell you, just as a sexologist, I stopped counting client after 1,100. I had 1,100 men, women, and youth I've worked with sexual confusion issues. Uh, I have never, in one single case, ever seen any form of sexual confusion, whether you're talking about same-sex attraction, unwanted, or gender confusion, or bisexuality, or sex offender work, or sexual addiction. I have never, in one case, ever seen someone that underneath it all, there isn't some emotional undercurrent that generated that symptomology. Ever. I've never had a client later that I thought, gosh, he doesn't fit any of these issues. Maybe he's born that way. I've never seen that. And I don't know that any good clinician who's worked with as many clients could honestly not say the same. And sometimes somebody might have 2 or 3 factors. Sometimes you've got 11 or 12 obvious factors. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's less so or more extreme abuse. Sometimes it's not abuse. But underneath any of the sexual issues, I've always seen some emotional undercurrent. And so I think not only ethically what you're talking about coming back to what you said, I think you also have a clinical oversight going on. If somebody comes into your office and they say, hey, I'm confused or I have these unwanted same-sex attractions, immediately in my mind, I'm thinking, and I might not say it to the client right away, but I'm thinking, what's underneath that? I'm thinking, what's generated this issue? And sometimes I can find, by asking them, well, what is it you're attracted to? Or what kinds of dynamics, or what's the context of the fantasy? And you can kind of find out what the trauma repetition is about, or that there is a lot of father hunger there, or whatever might be. But it does a client a terrible disservice by not recognizing as a clinician that underneath that attraction is a sexual, or excuse me, an emotional undercurrent that's driving it. And then getting to that, even if the client chooses to go be gay or live in a lifestyle, if you don't address those emotional undercurrents, you are harming the client.
Absolutely. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. And it's like with the clients I've worked with too, like I'm thinking about issues like fetishism. Like when I meet a client that has a fetish for, I don't know, I'll just make it up, high-heeled shoes or whatever, stilettos or whatever. In almost every case where I've had those clients with a fetish for that fetish goes back to some kind of abuse or traumatic experience they had where stilettos were involved. And
Yes.
then they formed that attachment like you're talking about so that for them in the future, sexual energy or being
Yes.
aroused is connected to, it's bonded or paired
Yes.
to stilettos. And so that's what the fetish is about.
Yes. Yes. That's a
And
very good example. Yes.
And it seems silly. And of course, some people say, well, cool. Like, from a totally amoral or just live and let live, civil libertarian perspective, they say, well, fine. If a client gets excited about stilettos, good for them or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my only response to that from a totally freedom perspective is, okay. I mean, I'm not saying that they can't be attracted to stilettos, but that's adding something to their sexual experience that they have to experience stilettos for them to have a satisfying sexual experience. And it's sort of an impediment a little bit because
Yes.
they have to have it. So it sort of creates a little bit of a barrier to just a totally natural experience that they
Yes.
would have to add stilettos, otherwise they can't get aroused.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so that's why from a therapeutic perspective, I would want to work with the client on realizing how are stilettos connected to this past experience, and then do you necessarily want to have stilettos as part of your sexual experience to be aroused, or would you prefer to be able to be aroused without having to have that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would also argue that if you just blindly say, well, go with stilettos, that you're actually in some cases keeping the client in a trauma repetition cycle. There's no resolution to whatever the emotional undercurrent is. So, a good example, I'll just give another one. And again, I don't want to be too graphic. But I worked with a teenage boy, 17 years old, and he had a fetish to feet. It was a foot fetish. And in his situation, after we started doing some work together, he realized and remembered a situation with an older boy, much older, who had forced him to undress, bend over, and do some terrible things to him. In that moment of heightened fear, here's this boy staring at his feet, and the other boy's feet next to his feet. The pain, the fear that gets sexualized, and here he is, years down the road, and he has a fetish with feet. Well, obviously. So, am I going to have him go with the foot fetish? He can choose what he wants to do, but it would be a tragedy. It would be clinically inappropriate not to deal with what that fetish is telling us about his trauma and about what happened. And we've got to go back and resolve some of that and flush that from his system a bit. Even if later he chose to continue engaging a fetish, we have got to see what it's telling us about what he hasn't resolved. Sometimes too, Kenny, I'll just tell you, because my faith is important to me, and I've had clients that are faith-based come to me and just in tears, why won't God fix this? Where's God's omnipotence in coming down and healing me like Jesus did with Lazarus and the man at the pool of Bethesda? And where is he? And I wondered that the first few years of my career, and I've seen over time, uh, and it's developed my opinion that God wants us to heal. He wants us to grow. He wants us to learn. And I think if God magically came down and healed this boy of his foot fetish, there's no growth, there's no healing. God would rob him of the opportunity to actually figure out what happened and to remember what happened. And when I had a young man who had unwanted same-sex attraction, and he's in tears in my office. He wants to get married. He wants to have children. He's just a 22-year-old kid in college. I just want to be normal. And he says, why won't God heal me? When he learned self-awareness piece that, the lack of a father figure drove him to this longing towards men and towards bonding. If God had magically healed all that, he would never have realized, I need men in my life. I need a father figure. I need a mentor. I've never had that. So I think sometimes we want God to be a magician instead of acknowledging God wants us to grow and to heal and to learn. And instead we ought to be asking, tell me, God, why? Tell me how. Guide my insight so I can learn what I need to do to move past all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great therapy process point. You're making me think of Job 42:5, where at the end of the book of Job, after all his trials and Job questioned God about all these different things. At the end there, Job says, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." In Job 42:5, and he's just saying that going through the process of all these struggles and all these challenges, I've really gotten to know you better, God. And in Job's case, that's what he wanted. Job wanted to know God better. Job wanted to understand. So for Job, it was worth it to go through all that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah. In the moment, though, we don't like it. Like, you know,
That's the truth.
I think if somebody, when Joseph was thrown into the pit and his brothers are laughing, selling him off, if somebody had, even an angel, had looked down into that pit and said, "It's okay, Joseph. Someday you'll know what this is going to be okay." Now,
Yeah.
he might have flipped him off. I don't know. It's in
Yeah.
the moment of your pain,
Yep.
it's very difficult to maintain your faith. But I do believe if we trust God through our pain, the truth is revealed, and we will learn and we will grow. It's just not comfortable.
Absolutely. Well, let me make a little turn in the conversation here real quick. Earlier on in our conversation, you were talking about sexual addiction stuff a little bit.
Yeah.
And of course, we've been talking about sexualized attachments. What's the connection between sexualized attachments and sexual addiction? Like, how are they connected or related, maybe?
Yeah. So at the root of sexual addiction, you always have attachment issues. Again, you don't know in the beginning what those are about. Somebody comes in and they're compulsively using pornography, and or they're compulsively acting out with random strangers. They're cruising or whatever the sexual addiction piece looks like. Uh, and in the beginning, we have to really deal with some of the patterns of the behavior. There's also chemicals involved. So when you look at SPECT scans by Dr. Amen with the brain, the same areas of the brain light up as you would have with a cocaine addict for sexual addiction. And people don't realize either with pornography addiction specifically, there is so much heightened novelty with it that it's highly addictive. I've worked with young adults in college, and they're looking at pornography 8 to 12 hours a day. I don't know how you
Mm-hmm.
get your schoolwork done. I don't,
Yeah.
So some of those things have to be addressed, but when you finally step back and you get sober and you start to look at underneath, you have attachment wounds, and some of those are sometimes sexualized attachment issues. It could be sexual abuse that's occurred, but sometimes it's physical abuse. You could have, especially nowadays with this generation, sometimes it's just simply a disruption in social connection. So I have a hard time feeling like I fit in or I belong. Um, in American Western culture, we often have this problem of thinking of bonding as with a person, or you bond with your mom and then you bond with your dad. And in other cultures, they often include the concept of belonging as a sense of attachment. So, and you can see that widely in adolescence and in young adulthood. You want to belong. So if I don't feel like I belong and I'm missing that attachment piece, that can be disruptive enough that my brain turns sideways to sexual acting out, to pornography or whatever it might be, as sort of a counterfeit method of bonding. It's a counterfeit method of attachment. So Dr. Kim Buck, that I've worked with in the past, she's amazing. She's often talked about sexual addiction as an intimacy disorder.
Uh-huh.
Dr. Ketahakis and Dr. Philip Flores have often talked about addiction, sexual addiction, as an attachment disruption, So any way you look at it, it really comes down to attachment wounds, social issues. The younger the generation gets, the teenagers I'm working with now, oftentimes it's an emotional escape. So rather than getting comfort from a person, I'm really sad. This girl's dissing on me, this is whatever. Now I turn to the pornography as a way of getting comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to if somebody might use marijuana for comfort or drinking for people, kids, young adults are using pornography to comfort themselves.
Yeah. Well, it's a
So
mood altering behavior. It does change the way you feel for a short period of time.
absolutely. And you have chemical effects, dopamine hits. The oxytocin is the most fascinating to me because your oxytocin levels go up anywhere from 400 to 500% with a sexual experience. And so if you consider I'm having a random anonymous encounter with someone, or I'm looking at a screen of just pictures or videos, and my oxytocin levels go up 500%. And oxytocin is a bonding chemical that's confusing to the brain. What did I bond to? I bonded to a video that disappears and goes away, or a person I'll never see again. And so the rewiring in the brain starts to confuse the prefrontal cortex, and then you have areas shutting down. And So there's an overlap, sexualized attachments. Not everyone is as severe with sexual addiction, but almost always you have some kind of attachment issues that are causing the brain to use other forms of sexual acting out as a way of trying to reconnect, trying to bond, trying to comfort.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's stick with this topic for just a little bit then about sexual addiction. How does it develop? I mean, like, I know back in the day, I mean, I'm 55 years old. But back in the day, it was, magazines and stuff like that. But I know
Yeah.
today it's more digital with kids.
Oh, yeah.
So, and you're working with this more recently than I have. How does it develop these days?
Yeah, the days of Playboy are gone. I don't even know if they sell Playboy anymore. I mean, I'm close to your age. I'm 56, but when we were kids, you had to go steal it from Circle K or find it in the sand lot, across the street. Uh, the the pornography nowadays is so accessible, and it's cheap, and it's free usually. That it makes it so easy. How does it begin? Back in the old days, we would always talk about trauma. Something emotionally so overwhelming occurred, whether it was sexual abuse or physical abuse or abandonment, something so overwhelming that you started to turn that way and go get the Playboys and other things or sexual acting out. When Cameron Thompson is a good example of that, and he talks about how he was raped at 9 years old and he went on to a life of perpetuating addiction behavior, anonymous hookups and things. Nowadays, and I would probably say even in our college groups that we are running, so if you're 25 or younger, a lot of times I think you're getting into pornography or sexual acting out as a way of escaping emotional distress uh, or social difficulties. And that's so accessible, so easy that you start to go that way. It's a little bit more of a new ideological component than we used to have before that. And COVID always, always, if you've already been leaning towards sexual compulsivity, the COVID lockdowns exacerbated any problems you might have already had. And not just because you're locked up at home, you have access all day. What parents don't realize, it was the inability to socially connect, to bond, to go on dates, to be out with your friends, to play. The lockdown itself created a loneliness. And when you're talking about, fifth to 10th graders, 11th, 12th graders, you're talking about a high developmental need to bond and belong to the group. And so now you've taken that out of the equation. They have nowhere to go with those needs, and the needs are now the hunger is just it's a famishing hunger to connect. So you have a lot more of the social dynamics, emotional distress dynamics going on than used to be. It's a shifting ideological, in ITAP they used to talk about there was a traditional model of sexual addiction recovery, and we all learned that. But then you had a contemporary, they call it the contemporary ideological model, which is now more what we're talking about, isolation. Um, I love the little video they did on Rat Park. Kenyon, I don't know if you ever watched Rat Park's Addiction. It's by Robot. I guarantee you some of the students on campus would know this. Robot, what is it? The robot one he does. But Rat Park was an experiment they did, and they took rats and they put them in a cage, and they gave them water and cocaine water. And they found over and over and over that these rats would eventually just do the cocaine water and die. And then some research came along and researcher and said, you know what, there's something wrong with this dynamic. And so he created a new rat cage, but he made it a rat park. And he put all kinds of fun things in there. He put a group of rats in there, and they could eat whatever they wanted. And he gave them the water, and he gave them the cocaine water. None of them continued with the cocaine water. They all drank normal water, and they were happy, and and that caused him to think, well, why do people get addicted to things so badly? It must be the cage, the loneliness, the isolation. And then as a template, they looked at Vietnam. Many, if not the majority of wounded Vietnam vets came home having been given massive amounts of heroin as a pain reliever. 98% of those Vietnam vets came home to loving friends and family and never had any more problems with the heroin. They got off of their painkillers. 2% that came home lonely, rejected, PTSD, no family, no support, all became hopelessly addicted. So there's this piece of connection that's often missing in the discussion about any addiction, but especially about sexual addiction.
Yeah, that's making perfect sense. And what I'm hearing you say too is, I mean, yes, sexual addiction causes dysfunction, and some of these other sexualized attachments can have a dysfunctional component to them, but the developmental needs that are underneath all of this, there's nothing dysfunctional or evil or bad about those at all. They're
Right.
just developmental needs that we all have, like needs for friendship and connection and feeling
Yes.
loved and all that.
Bonding.
Yeah, bonding. I mean, none
Yeah.
of that's bad. It's just we all need it, and some of us get it, and some of us don't.
Yeah.
And
In fact,
so
I would go beyond
yeah,
that. I would say not only is it not bad, it's legitimately critical for healthy development.
yeah,
So what's
yeah,
wrong is not that you got addicted to sexual stuff or to heroin, or what's wrong is that you didn't get the connections you needed, the support, the love, the sense of belonging to be able to overcome and push through those challenges. That's what's wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the fact that you were abandoned, neglected, uncared for, didn't fit in, bullied, whatever those things are about.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm cognizant of the time a little bit too, and I got a few more things to ask you. So let me switch again to another topic.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've described, sexualized attachment and sexual addiction and all these examples, but let's get to the therapy healthy part of this. Like, what does healing and recovery look like for people coming out of these kind of struggles?
Yeah. I like to divide it up into those two categories, Kenyon. I know we talked about this briefly, maybe,
Yeah.
but healing in my mind is addressing all of those emotional undercurrents that might be going on. And that might take a few years of trying to uncover them layer upon layer. Like Shrek said, it's an onion, you have to unpeel. And you
Yep.
keep going through and healing the inner child and working on all the wounds and the trauma, whatever it is, sense of belonging. That's the healing portion. In my mind, then the recovery portion is really about the imprinting piece, that memorized compulsive component of behavior. You have to stop acting out. So if I'm a sex addict, I had a kid I worked with, he's 30 years old, and he can't even afford food anymore. He's living on campus because he is so compulsive. It's so entrenched with the behaviors. Like
Yeah.
he'll look at pornography, and then an hour later he's at the bookstore, and then an hour later he's soliciting prostitutes and into the dominatrix stuff, and it's just he can't even afford to feed himself. You have to learn how to stop doing those things as you're working on the healing components, and that takes a lot of hard work. No amount
Yeah.
of therapy or psychodrama or gestalt work is just going to magically take some of that away. You have to learn how to stop and learn tools for behavior management, go to 12 steps. And recovery is hard. I think it's hard. But if you don't also address the healing component, the emotional stuff, the trauma, the need to belong, whatever those wounds are, those deficits are, then chances are you're going to go back to what you did before because you're so hungry. That's what your mind remembers as some way of coping.
Mm-hmm.
So you got kind of do both emotional healing work, and behavioral recovery work at the same time. And it's tough.
Yeah, yeah. And I heard you say earlier too that if what's undergirding all this is maybe loneliness or lack of connection, part of the healing then is having friendships. I mean,
Yes.
having healthy friendships. Like, so if you start to feel lonely, well, instead of taking your drug of choice, whether it's pornography or heroin or whatever, you go and talk to friends and you
Yes.
work through that sense of loneliness, and you don't feel lonely anymore when you talk to your friends.
Absolutely. You feed the need. That's what I
Yes.
tell the kids, when I'm working with them. You got to learn how to first identify the need and then go feed it.
Yeah.
I, and sometimes that might require some group therapy, something a little bit more than just your friends. Uh,
Sure.
with our high school group, I remember we had a new kid coming in once. We had about 16 kids in that group. And the new kid comes in and he's in tears because he doesn't want to tell his story. He doesn't want to talk about it. One of the older boys got up, sat next to him and said, "It's okay, man. We'll listen. We're here. We don't judge you. And the boy went on to tell his story and how he had done such a thing, this certain thing.
Yeah.
And in shock himself, because none of the boys even blinked, they all had something. And then he starts really sobbing because now he realizes it's okay to share his shame and talk about it. And a level of acceptance he didn't have for himself that he was suddenly receiving allowed him to displace the shame, feel acceptance, self-love in ways he hadn't experienced before. And that cloud starts to lift. And then it's easier to stop doing some of those things. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, this is great. I mean, we've really covered a lot of ground about sexualized attachment, sexual addiction, what all this looks like. But before we wrap it up, though, I always try to ask all the guests sort of a catch-all question of, what did we not get to today? Or when you were coming here to get on the podcast today, was there another point or something that God sort of put on your heart or mind that you wanted to share? So let me sort of end with that and let you share whatever's the last thing on your mind here.
Yeah, I think about the young adults, the college kids, the high school kids. They are receiving so many negative messages and dishonest messages about who you are and try this and that. One thing I would say in conclusion is, if you are struggling with confusion about your gender, about sexuality, about unwanted same-sex attractions, about compulsive sexual use or pornography, if you're struggling with any of those kinds of things, there are answers to your plight, and you don't need to struggle alone. Find a counselor on campus, find someone you can trust, a mentor, somebody to ask for help. Go get support. Stop being by yourself. Stop isolating. I know it might be shameful. You might be horrified that anyone would know about the confusion or whatever it is. Go find help. Find somebody to help walk with you so you're not alone. The worst thing you can do is stay alone with all of the confusion. So that's one thing I would say. And I've seen hundreds of men, women, and youth who have successfully overcome all of this, and their temptations diminish and shift and changed back to a normal, more biologically oriented direction. And you can do that too, but you'll have to be brave enough to tell somebody you're confused. And so I guess my final words would be, have courage. Joshua 1:9. Have courage. Get out there. Ask somebody to help you. Ask somebody to be there for you, and find answers. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So it might take you some time, but have courage. God is faithful, and there are answers to your struggles. Absolutely.
And I've read one of your books, and I thought it was great. So let's mention that resource. Do you have a website, or could you mention some of the books you've written for any listeners who might want to get those?
Yeah, I have. The most recent book I wrote is called Healing and Recovery, and it's perspective for young men with sexualized attachments. And so we address things like pornography, same-sex attraction, gender confusion, things like that. And you should be able to go onto Amazon and look for that. My website is floydgodfrey.com. You can certainly find links on some things there, and more information about some of those topics there.
Well, that sounds great. Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed hearing all this today. It's certainly relevant, because if you haven't run into this yet in your private practices, you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely out there. So thank you so much, Floyd. I really appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Kenny. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. And listeners, join us again next time here on the Mental Healthy Podcast. We look forward to having you with us, and we'll have another great guest. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.